Well, as you know, there have been two phases of the impact of IT. From 95 to 2000, the IT impact was driven by production of information technology. Of course, the United States is very intensive in information technology production, producing computers and semiconductors and, of course, software. Then the second phase took place after the year 2000, after the infamous dot-com crash in the financial markets. And that was associated with an increase in productivity in the IT using industries. So if you think about the IT using industries, those are ones that are affected by the internet. So trade, financial services, all the things that are now moving on to the internet. Now, if we think about the situation in Europe, we can see that, first of all, Europe is much less specialized in information technology production than is the United States. There's a lot of software produced in Europe. Some of the strongest firms are based in Europe. But in terms of hardware, Europe has a much more limited role than does the United States, or Japan for that matter. So the impact of information technology from 95 to 2000 was much more limited in Europe because of the fact that it was associated with information technology production. After the dot-com crash, there was actually a decline in the impact of IT in Europe, associated with the crash, of course, and an increase in the United States. Now, why was that? The reason was that in the United States, we have achieved a single market, not only in goods, which is characteristic of the parts of Europe that are members of the European Union, but also in services. And as you know, the European Union has failed to achieve a single market in services. This is something that is hotly controversial, and certainly the policy circles in Europe are very well aware of this. But the impact of this is that the spread of internet-based technologies in the service and trade industries has been much less thoroughgoing in Europe than in the United States. So in the longer run, I think the internet, of course, is going to penetrate into large parts of the European economy. Unfortunately, the fact that there is not a single market in services is going to be a barrier. However, you know, there are specific areas where Europe has played a very, very important role in terms of a unified market. Take banking services, for example. There are now Spanish banks operating in the UK, in Germany, and so on. There are German banks operating in France. I mean, it's something that is moving in the direction of a single market. And of course, that's something that will enhance the incentives to use IT effectively. So in the longer run, I think that there will be a tendency in this direction. But the only thing that would drive Europe to the level of utilization of IT technology that you see now in the United States would be a single market in services. Latin America has had very impressive growth over the last 15 years. Despite the fact that there has been an occasional interruption, as in 2001 here in Argentina, where we're conducting this interview. But the fact is that productivity in terms of output per unit of input in Latin America is very, very high by comparison with the level of development. So that you find in Argentina, in Chile, in Brazil, all the leading Latin American countries, a very high level of productivity. What is it then that accounts for the fact that these countries are only in the middle range as far as income and output per capita is concerned? That has to do with investment, not only in information technology, but in other kinds of capital. And so long as that investment is deficient, I think that Latin America will be growing at a rate that is below potential. So studies of productivity make you optimistic about the state of technology in Latin America. On the other hand, they show a large gap between what is potentially possible given the level of technology here, which I think is quite comparable to what has been achieved already in Europe. And so I think there's a big gap here that has to be filled, and what's needed is more investment. including investment in information technology. The EU KLEMS project succeeded, I think, beyond expectations on the part of the European Union in getting to the roots of the differences that we discussed earlier between Europe and the United States in terms of the utilization of information technology. So the levels of technology that you see in Europe, the use of information technology, is definitely behind the United States. And in order to understand that, it was necessary to go beyond the aggregate figures that are often used in these international comparisons between Europe and the United States and focus on the performance of individual industries. So if you now go back to the issue of service sector productivity and the performance of the services, the EU KLEMS project revealed for the first time that it was market-based services, in other words, services that are provided by the private sector as opposed to public services like education and health and so on. It's those private services that really differentiate Europe and the United States. That was the major finding of the EU KLEMS project. So that was a tremendous success as far as economic research is concerned. There was a specific objective. That objective was achieved. It produced results that were very, very surprising and very illuminating, and that I think accounts for the reception, which has been very favorable on the part of the European Union officials of the EU KLEMS research. Many of the problems that were identified in Europe can be seen in middle-income countries. For example, the countries of Latin America, Russia. These are countries that are considerably below the achievement of the main industrialized countries in Europe, like Spain and the UK and France and Germany. These are countries where there are similar differences that have to be identified. I expect that market services will be an important part of the story of the underdevelopment of middle-income countries, the gap that I identified earlier for Latin American countries. But it remains to be seen, and therefore I'm very excited about the prospect of a Latin America KLEMS project involving the major industrializing countries of Latin America. There's a similar project which we're launching in Russia, which is at more or less the same level of income. And there are projects in Asia, in India, in China, which are at much lower levels of development, of course, and Japan and Korea, which are quite comparable to the leading European countries. All of these things, I think, will contribute to understanding the role of investment, and especially investment in information technology, in world economic growth. And therefore, I'm an enthusiastic advocate of these KLEMS projects around the world. Let me make this distinction again between production of IT and the use of IT. I don't see a great role for the production of IT in Latin America in terms of, say, hardware, electronics, that type of thing. I think that Latin American countries have a different comparative advantage that trade economists have spent a lot of time analyzing. But in terms of the use of IT, Latin American economies, like other middle-income economies, have a very major role for the trade sector and for services. These make up 60% of the average Latin American economy. If you focus on market services and trade, maybe 50%. So for half of these economies, more or less the same principles apply, namely that it will be possible to stimulate a lot of economic growth through investment in information technology. This is investment that has to be produced in a way that is adapted to local conditions. And therefore there is a role for Latin American firms to develop software that is appropriate to Latin American conditions, adapt hardware, networks, and so on that are appropriate to conditions here. But there's no doubt that information technology is going to play a very important role in the future in stimulating economic growth in Latin America.